All right, chapter 14 is a nice way to end the book. It, in some ways, touches back on some of the principles that we talked about in chapter 1 in terms of the complexities of organizational communication and the things that were constantly evolving and changing. One of those was the idea of globalism. That's a lot of what chapter 14 is dealing with when it talks about this idea of the changing landscape of organizations. It's referring to a lot of the changes that have occurred uh, in our world over the centuries. And certainly that is very much related to materials we talked about last week in terms of technology. But certainly if you explore how we have previously come from a manufacturing mindset in sort of the industrial age, and then more into this, the idea of the Reformation and the era of modernism and the shift to service and doing things, and very much a postmodern world. And a lot of that is covered in this particular chapter. So let's dive into it. I've decided to stick with a simple abbreviated PowerPoint, and we'll highlight some of the main things here. So let's move on. Okay, in terms of communication in the global workplace, certainly there's been a large increase, a significant increase in globalization, and what that means. And a lot of that has to do with where it says political changes. The idea of boundaries shifting is with one country adopting another, or with one regime being overthrown to take over another one, and so on and so forth. In some of the, let's talk about some of the factors that have contributed to globalization. The idea of a laissez-faire capitalism, the idea that, that if you just sort of throw things together, that capitalism dictates, who will rise to the surface, and it's sort of unstructured. And increasing democratization, the idea of more involvement, and certainly technology. So there are significant issues to consider here in terms of the effects of globalism uh, and the ways that the globalism influences communication and organizational communication. Some of the issues that are talked about in your book in terms of the effects have to do with this idea of time and space being compressed, and that you don't have a whole lot of awareness of necessarily when or where you are because of globalism and technology. That it's increased this sense of a global consciousness, that we have this idea of how what we do here affects what goes on in another place altogether. And that can lead to somewhat disembedded organizations that don't have roots, disembedded people that don't have roots. And, that is not all entirely a positive thing. Now, this table is in your textbook, the idea of organizational types within a global marketplace. Now, when we talk about a global communication, notice this, that it's an organization that identifies with the global system rather than any one particular nation. Multicultural, there's one country that you identify, but you simply recognize the need for diversity, and you make your effort. Certainly a good step, but not the same thing as a global marketplace. So be somewhat familiar with these 5 types of organizations. Oh, here we have a continuation of the effects of globalization. I mentioned these up here. The idea of convergence and divergence. Convergence means it's when an organization's attempt to adapt their practices to this idea of a global marketplace. So therefore, I'm going to work to adapt to the way that they do things in China. I'm going to make an effort to adapt more to an Eastern European mindset in order to be more successful financially in my business. And communication is my way, my means of doing that. Divergence, sort of the opposite, emphasizes the distinction amongst us. And so, yeah, we explore how meaning's constructed, but that's on an individual level. And we look at things like impact of cultural norms on an individual level. So a different approach altogether. The idea of communication in an era of shifting identity. In the old days that your grandparents worked in organizations, they kept their job in their particular business probably for 20, 30, 40 years. And that was typical, you know, that you stuck to one or two different jobs throughout your adult life. Whereas now we have much more of a shifting population, and that affects this notion of corporate identity. And so it's sort of this ongoing rhetorical struggle to identify you are organizationally. And organizations can be proactive in trying to attempt to develop and communicate that identity, whether that's they're going to impose themselves on the environment rather than simply acclimate themselves or adapt themselves to it. They want to create a positive image. It's all about PR, it's all about marketing in order to achieve their long-range goals. And that these images aren't always created through purposive campaigns. What does that mean? That means that people form perceptions of corporate image on a variety of message. It can be crisis, it can be a logo, it can be symbolic, it can be their personal experience with an employee. There's a lot of different types of messages that lead to this overall idea of corporate identity. And that image becomes particularly critical during times of crisis. And that can have a lot to do with both long-term and short-term survival, especially in crises. Communication in a service economy. There's definitely been a shift from a manufacturing economy. We're less about the product and we're more about the process. We're more about doing a service for another person. It's very hard to deny the importance of service in your daily life. Think about whether it's needing help and calling a helpline, whether it's wanting something done for you rather than the mere purchasing of an item. And that in general, the perception is that the quality of service is declining. And whether that's because of corporate downsizing or that people just sacrifice customer service because it's cheaper, or they believe that service work involves more emotional labor, and that leads to less than ideal service, so on and so forth. The last big aspect that's talked about in your chapter is this idea of communication in the age of a disposable worker. And that connects to what I had alluded to earlier, which is our world is very different than the organizational world that your grandparents had. Reich brings up he has an article where he essentially is exploring the notion that it is a different employment world nowadays. There are more contingent workers, there are more part-time workers, and we're not going back to the way it was. This is a new era that we are in, and some of these workers are contingent because they choose to be so, and some are not by choice, and that can be for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes there are employers that only hire temporary workers. It's cheaper that way, and this trend has hit all different levels of the organization. There are financial implications for the worker, both in terms of salary and in terms of benefits. They are at higher risk for a variety of things like injury, illness, and death. Lack of identity, employee identification. They receive directives from staffing agencies and the organization, so that can lead to a role conflict because they have two different bosses. Now, on the good side, the chapter discusses that there's a little bit of a silver lining to having these quote-unquote disposable workers, that they're having this people come and go can breathe energy and new life into a stale environment, and so that can have a positive ramification because you're increasing the diversity. Okay, so that is the majority of Chapter 14 in a nutshell. It's just important to realize that organizations are changing, they are shifting, they are not the same as they were 40 years ago. And more than likely, for your grandchildren, they will be in a different organizational world than you are today. So it is constantly changing, and those are things that have to be adapted to, and truly only the most insightful CEOs leading efficient organizations are able to keep up with these changes. So that's it for now.